Will there be a wealth tax in the UK? That right there is the big question because there are more and more reports of this being something that is being considered, or at least it's not being ruled out. Now we know that Rachel Reeves needs to plug the fiscal hole. It's quite a big hole right now. And Labour don't necessarily want to increase taxes on the working man. So, what are the alternatives? I'm going to take you through a segment that was run on Sky last week, which delves into the various options that Rachel Reed could go down in order to implement this wealth tax, if you will. And once we watch this video, we're then going to look at some of the commentary that is coming out from economists who are strongly urging the government to consider a wealth tax to ensure that as a nation we're taken seriously when it comes to our fiscal responsibilities.
So it's looking like the government needs to find tens of billions of pounds to meet its fiscal rules. The tax burden is at a generational high, and the government has promised it won't raid workers or businesses. So now some Labour MPs have their eyes set on something else, a wealth tax. The Prime Minister has refused to rule it out. And this is why. So as a country, our stock of wealth, and that's the total value of everything owned, is much larger than our income, the total amount of money earned in a year. This is the ratio between the two. And that disparity, it's been growing, especially during that era of cheap money we saw after 2008 that fueled asset prices while wages stagnated. Basically, it means that the average worker will have to work for more years to buy assets, say a house, for example.
I'm going to pause it there because this is something that we are seeing in arguments rife across the society right now. The fact that asset prices have risen quite considerably, wages have stagnated. We now have a generation of people that feel like it's impossible to get on the property ladder because the difference between what we earn and the asset prices is so vast. Getting a deposit, it for a lot of people feels insurmountable. We're seeing that in society literally right now. Let's continue.
And now MPs are trying to better capture some of this growth in wealth to help rebalance the public finances, but also, they argue, to create a fairer tax system. Because take a look at what happens when that wealth gets passed down. And this shows your typical 50-year-old. So around the time people start to inherit from their parents. And those born to the poorest 20% of parents over here are worth about £200,000 at that age. And those born to the richest, they're worth about £800,000 at that age. This is before they inherit anything. But those inheritances, well, they only widen the disparity further. This is where inheritance tax kicks in, which of course is a tax on wealth. But its impact on addressing that balance in the red there is pretty small. Most people don't end up meeting the threshold to pay it.
Okay, now this is a really important observation to have here. So just notice on the clip where they talked about that threshold for inheritance tax, because they are right. Let me just go full screen here quickly. They are correct. Not that many people actually end up paying inheritance tax. But what I find interesting is on the graphs, go back here 1 second, that little segment right there is looking at the top 20% of the population. Now, this is the problem that I have in this conversation and how this is being framed right now, because, and tell me if you agree in the comment section below. I don't think if you're going to be discussing a wealth tax that you can consider it being a wealth tax if you're targeting the top 20%. I think a wealth tax should be targeted at the top 1%. So people who have large sums of money in assets. Because the top 20%, where does that really put you in the demographic? Does that really mean that you've acquired quite a lot of wealth? I mean, £800,000. The IHT threshold is 1 million when you consider residential properties. In my opinion, we need to be aiming for much, much bigger estates than 800,000 that falls below that inheritance tax threshold for IHT purposes. Let's continue.
So, we could bring more people into inheritance tax, but it's already a wildly unpopular policy. So, what other avenues could we?
And if you recall, they actually brought more people into inheritance tax because now pensions are going to be included in the calculation for inheritance tax purposes.
explore. Well, firstly, there's capital gains tax, which people pay when they sell a second property or shares, for example. We could reform that so that the tax rate is the same as it is for income tax. Economists believe that that could bring in £12 billion.
Okay, now CGT is what she's talking about here, capital gain. So if you've invested money, you get a gain on your capital, you basically pay a tax based on that gain. And what she's mentioned there is bringing it in line with income tax. So if you're a 20% basic rate taxpayer, 40% if you're over and above the £125,000 per year income level, you would be charged because you lose your personal allowance effectively 50 to 60%. That's what they're talking about here. But I don't know if you recall, Rachel Reeves did actually change the capital gains regime last year. And what she did was she basically increased both the basic rate and the high rate tax thresholds, but it's kind of backfired on her when you look at the data. So, according to this, CGT receipts dropped from nearly 17 billion in 2022-2023 to 14.5 billion in 23-2024, and now just 13.1 billion in 24-25. So even though she's made those changes, it doesn't seem as though it's been effective. So how far can they push CGT? I'm sure that they'll find a way to make it work if they absolutely had to. They've got some very smart people working in the Treasury. They could make it work, but I'd be interested to know what that's going to look like. And that is also going to be a bit of a hard sale. We literally just seen CGT change. So another one potentially before the end of the year being announced could be a little of a bitter pill for anyone to swallow.
We could also levy national insurance contributions on investment income, so rent from properties or dividends. That's another £11 billion. And then, you may have heard a lot of chatter about this recently, a new tax on the stock of wealth, so 1 to 2% on assets over £10 million. And that could raise between £12 billion and £24 billion, depending on.
Okay, so this is kind of where we're going here, right? So, a national insurance contribution on investments. I mean, would that be classed as a tax on working people? If you're investing, many people will argue that you're not a working person, but by the strict definition, you would be working to obviously have the income to invest. This is all going to get into murky waters here, and we can get stuck into definitions and all of the intricacies of it. But can they do that? Would they do that? I'm not sure that this would be taken off the table. What I find to be more interesting, though, is a 1% tax or a 2% tax on assets over that £10 million bracket. Because I think you're going to find more, I think you'll find that that targets more than just the top 20%. And I think that's really where we need to start having the conversation. Let's continue with this article, with
On the
this
rate.
report.
So, is this problem solved? Not quite. There's a lot of uncertainty around these numbers, especially around some of these new taxes that target the very rich. Wealthier people tend to be good at arranging their tax affairs. They are also more mobile, so these figures aren't assured. And valuing assets, well, that's a whole new headache for HMRC. None of this is as easy as it sounds. That being said, the idea of a new wealth tax is popular with the public, perhaps unsurprisingly when you consider most people won't have to pay it. Even increases in capital gains tax, however, are far more popular than things like income tax and VAT, those so-called taxes on working people that the Chancellor has promised to freeze. So you can see the political temptation to go after the very wealthy. But there are no easy wins. The returns are unpredictable, and that's little comfort to a Chancellor whose budget is operating on such small margins.
Right, and there you go. So this leads into, I guess, the big question: where do they go? Now, if they did say, "Look, let's do a 1% or 2% tax on assets over 10 million quid," they're still going to have certain issues. I mean, they're going to have certain issues when it comes to capital gains as well, because you can't tax capital gains until the gain is actually being realized. So, how do you tax unrealized gains? Just as an example, let's just say you've bought a house and you bought this house for 200K. You fast forward to now, and the house is now worth 500,000. That's a 300,000 pound, a gain. And let's say it's an investment property, right? So you've got 300,000 pounds of a gain sat in this property. How is the government going to charge you or apply a capital gains tax without you selling that property. That's what they're going to have to contend with. That's going to be the issue. When it comes to wealth, yes, people are mobile. I mean, I would argue that you don't necessarily have to be uber wealthy in order to be mobile. You can still move if you needed to. That's going to be the big question. So they've got a lot of wrangling, they've got a lot of research, thought around how would they actually implement this and how would this actually work in the long term. Because whilst the idea of a wealth tax is very, very popular, and I know from videos that I've made on the channel that people really do want a wealth tax, how is it going to work out in practical terms? I personally believe that if you want to address the gap between the classes, this income inequality, wealth inequality, you're going to have to implement something like a wealth tax. But what does it look like in practice? That's probably one of the biggest arguments that people have against Gary Stevenson's. Like, how are you going to do this? How will it work? So on and so forth. I personally don't know how it's going to work. And that leads me on to another article that is circulating, and this is, I'm recording this Monday evening, you'll see this tomorrow. This came out today on Monday, and this is the report. And it's saying here, Starmer and Reeves should prepare UK for wealth tax, says top economists. Now, this is how they open up this article. Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves have been urged by a group of the world's leading economists to use the autumn budget to prepare Britain for the introduction of a new wealth tax to tackle extreme levels of inequality. With the government under pressure to raise taxes, the group of economists, including the French expert on wealth inequality Thomas Pesquet, said the UK Prime Minister could raise tens of billions of pounds while positioning Britain as a progressive leader on the world stage. Now, as we already know from that Sky report, between 12 and 24 billion pounds could be raised with a wealth tax. But what form does it take? Let me know what you think in the comment section down below. What I will say though is this: for a lot of people who are trying to build their own wealth through investing and acquiring property, this will feel like you're being punished. We're being punished for doing the right thing. We've been encouraged and been told to use our money wisely, to invest, to position it so that we're not reliant on the state when it comes to retirement, so on and so forth. That's a big government agenda right now. This kind of stuff feels punitive to the idea that you've been pushed to do this. Here's what I'm going to say though. Look, I'm a big, big believer in controlling the controllables. What Rachel Reeves, Keir Starmer do, we have no influence over. They're in the government now. They've got a good while to go. This is still their first year. They're going to do what they're going to do. But I don't think, and this is really important, I don't think that you should stop investing, stop trying to acquire profits, assets, and therefore profits, just because they might actually introduce a wealth tax or change capital gains tax. It's like cutting off your nose to spite your face. It's not productive. It's counterintuitive. So control what you can control. Still allocate money to the things that make sense in terms of investments and assets that you can acquire. Be stringent and be structured in your financial management and how you allocate your cash. And then you can figure all of that stuff out later on. Look, one thing that we do know, and they've already mentioned it in that Sky article, is that there are ways in which you can use some of the tax system to still put yourself in the better position by tax planning. So worry about the tax planning later on. Do the right thing with the money, acquiring, investing right now, and deal with that when it comes around to it. I don't know if you agree. Let me know in the comment section down below. Catch you later.